This reminds me of Ellen White and how she mentioned that this legislation for morality is going to come from the people. It's not going to necessarily come from the government enforcing it on the people, but that the people will be rising up and demanding it. And that could even mean the people who are being brought into the government, but it's coming from the people. Yeah, definitely.
And, they work right out of the White House. They've never done that. That's never been done before. No other president allowed that. I think, they say separation. They say separation between church and state, they told me. I said, all right, let's forget about that for one time. We said, really, the separation? I don't know. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not sure. But whether there's separation or not, you guys are in the White House where you should be, and you're representing our country, and we're bringing religion back to our country, and it's a big deal.
So we need to forget about church and state this one time. Why not a second time or a third time?
This is now the big question, this separation of church and state, and that's what we're going to get into here. Why does there need to be a separation? Was there a separation? Because a lot of these people are saying there was no separation.
That's right. I mean, he doesn't seem to know. So is it even part of it? Yeah.
So this is the big question. And if there isn't, what does that mean? So this is Pastor Robert Jeffries and on the separation of church and state on Huckabee Today.
Mm-hmm. There's the phrase that we hear so often in our culture. It is not a phrase that is even in the Constitution, although I would say probably 8, maybe 9 out of 10 Americans would swear up and down it is in the Constitution. That phrase is separation of church and state. Do you believe there is such a thing? And if there is, what in the world does that mean?
There's absolutely no such thing. And people have twisted that phrase to refer to actually the separation of faith from public life, which is the real goal of every liberal. Look, the phrase separation of church and state, as you said, doesn't appear in the First Amendment. It doesn't appear in any amendment. It doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution. It's a phrase that was used by Thomas Jefferson in a private letter to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, who had heard a rumor that he was going to elevate as president the Congregational Church to be the church for America. And Baptists get upset whenever they think somebody else is going to be in charge. And so they protested. And Thomas Jefferson said, no, we're not going to do such a thing. And anytime the government back then talked about the church and state, it was talking about denominations. The Bible, the Constitution prohibits anybody from elevating one Christian denomination over another.
Separation of church and state is not a constitutional doctrine. It's not even in the Declaration of Independence. It's nowhere in our laws. But people still use that phrase as if somehow it's holy and absolutely applicable. But in reading Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist Association, it really was the opposite of what people apply. It had more to do with saying, you and the church can say anything you want to, and you can say it to the government. But the government cannot speak to the church and dictate to it what its pastors can say or what its congregation can say. I heard years ago, and I thought it was the most powerful thing I ever heard about them.
So one of the big emphasis that these guys are talking about is that the state should not have influence to the church, but the church absolutely can have influence on the state. And we're going to discuss that a little bit more in a while, but they're almost saying it as if it can only be a one-way street somehow.
Yeah.
But that's not actually possible, but let's continue the video.
Okay.
Not one of the Bill of Rights restricts a citizen. In fact, every one of the Bill of Rights empowers the citizen. The restriction is on government. In every single one of the 10 First Amendments to the Constitution, we know them as the Bill of Rights, every one of them says what the government can't do, not what the people can't do. what's wrong with our culture where that's not clearly understood?
Well, we've got an ignorant culture, Governor, who don't know American history. They don't know the Constitution. They don't know the fact that the Supreme Court never used the phrase separation of church and state until 1947. You know, if it was such an instrumental part of our nation, why wasn't it used in any Supreme Court decision before 1947? It's because it's a figment of people's imagination. And that 1947 case, the Everson case, was one that tried to deny church or government support of the Catholic Church, and the Supreme Court ruled against it. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at that time was Hugo Black, who was happened to be a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And the only thing the Ku Klux Klan hated more than blacks were Catholics. And, Justice Clarence Thomas and others have recently pointed out that this court decision was an anti-Catholic decision. It was rooted in religious prejudice, and it deserves to be buried.
So interesting that he says the separation of church and state is a figment of people's imagination, and that it's an anti-Catholic concept.
Yeah.
That is an extremely important thing to note, because is it really an anti-Catholic concept? And is it not? And we're going to take a look at that when we look at America's beginnings and what was the driving force behind those people who founded America.
And to understand the answer to what that is, we got to ask the question, what is the meaning of the separation of church and state? You've heard it. It's used as the battle cry for those who want to rip God out of all of culture. There's a separation of church and state. There's a wall of separation of church and state. Now, let me ask you a question. Where did that phrase come from? Do you think that that's a phrase that is in the Constitution? The separation of church and state. Sounds like it is, right? But it's not. It's not in the Constitution. Do you think it's in the Declaration of Independence? No, it's not. It's not in the Declaration of Independence. Is it in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution? No, it's not in the Bill of Rights. The separation of church and state is a phrase. It was a personal phrase used by Thomas Jefferson in a personal letter to someone who was a person of faith in a group of Baptists and Congregationalists from Danbury, Connecticut. And they asked him his position on what is the role of government with regard to the church. Now remember, he understood that the founders had come out of countries where the king or the government controlled the church. And it was the king of this country became the king of the church.
That's not true.
And what he said is, no, you don't have to worry about a king controlling the church or an official government church, because there's a wall, an impenetrable wall that keeps the government from reaching in and telling you, the church, what to do.
Just a minute. Hold on. That is so not true. The king did not control the church in the Dark Ages. It was definitely the Pope that was controlling the kings. If the king didn't do what the Pope wanted them to do, he was excommunicated, and everybody in the entire country that king ruled was in danger of being excommunicated as well. They weren't allowed to get married. They weren't allowed to get a Christian burial. They weren't allowed to participate in any of the rites and the ceremonies that they normally did during church. And that's just insane that he's saying this.
It's basically exact opposite of what he said, but we have these sentiments that are being flipped around, like the Dark Ages was actually a time of enlightenment and great progress. And now, the kings were in charge of, no. The church was in charge of the state, and that situation is what 100% of the time causes persecution.
Right. And this is
even the same sects of people that, you could say.
This is a rewriting of history. They're actually trying to re-educate people to believe something that didn't even happen so that they can get them on their side.
Absolutely.
Going back to this idea of separation of church and state, and again, I could riff on this ad nauseum because it's just so ridiculous, right? Is that it's not constitutional, because you go a layer deeper. People that even say that, do you believe in separation of morality and state? Nobody does. So all laws are a reflection of morality, and all morality comes from somewhere. There is no such thing as neutral morality. And we believe what the founders believed because they put it in the halls of Congress, they put it in the Supreme Court, and they put it all throughout the country, which is that the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, is the core morality of how a society and a civilization should exist, right? The 10 Commandments of every person.
This is so deceptive, so twisted. Government cannot legislate morality. It can only legislate civil laws. And the civil laws may contain things like thou shalt not kill and you should not, perjure yourself and things like that match those last 6 parts of the 10 Commandments. But it's based on civil law, not based on morality.
It's not based on religion, and it's not based on the commandments directly, because that would be now enforcing religion onto other people. No, it's what the civil government is supposed to do is dictate to the civil rights that you are not impeding on other individuals' rights.
Right.
Each individual has a right to do and live their life and everything. If you are impeding their ability to do that, that is where the government aids the people to have their individual rights, not to legislate morality.
No.
Because morality is a totally different thing. What you think is moral or immoral is not the same thing as what's affecting someone else's freedom to exercise.
Correct.
See, most people today who insist upon a rigid separation of church and state are unaware that that phrase derives not from the Constitution itself, of course, but from a personal letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association in 1802. He explained that, quote, because religion is a matter that lies solely between man and his God, the language of the First Amendment is a vital safeguard of our rights of conscience. See, Jefferson said he revered, this is another quote, that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. That's what he wrote in his letter to the Danbury Baptist. But Jefferson clearly did not mean that metaphorical wall was to keep religion from influencing issues of civil government. To the contrary, it was meant to keep the federal government from impeding the religious practice of citizens. The founders wanted to protect the church from an encroaching state, not the other way around.
The reason we had so many overreaching regulations in our nation is because the church complied. The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. That is not how our founding fathers intended it. And I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk that's not in the Constitution. It was in a stinking letter, and it means nothing like what they say it does.
So we have to pull this apart a little bit. Now, I guarantee you that the same people who think the church should control the state would not agree with that in Muslim countries, that the Muslim faith should control the state and then the state influence all the people.
Oh, no,
to,
never.
Because they're like, oh, but they're pressing down the women. So
never.
Now, here's the thing. Can you have a situation where, okay, so you have one group, they want separation of church and state, where the state does not influence the church and the church does not influence the state. Now you have this group of people who says, well, no, we don't want the state influencing the church. We want the church influencing the state. Is that possible is the question. And the reality is no, because once you're both playing the game, you're influencing each other to do different moves. If we're playing a game of chess and you don't want me to influence your moves, well, then you can't play the game with me. Right. Because every move I do, you're going to have to somehow counter that. And, you can't have the church affecting the state without the state now, in effect, creating laws that reflect in some way church legislation. Correct. Which means the church is affecting, or the state is affecting the church.
It's automatic that they both influence each other.